Welcome to the first episode of the Goblincast, a weekly series that I plan to do, which will be kind of a culmination of all of my main channel videos into one podcast. So I hope you guys all enjoy. The first episode is going to cover a lot of the stuff with Shireen's plotline. The first segment will be about the Davos fingerbones theory, with maybe Melisandre glamoring as Davos, or Melisandre using somebody else to be glamored as Davos, and how that may impact Shireen's death. And the second segment will piggyback off of that, and we'll also be focusing on Shireen's death, but more on the idea of could there be a Greyscale plague? Talking about that in A Song of Ice and Fire and Greyscale as a whole, alongside of the John Connington plotline as well, and what that will have for the future of the Winds of Winter. And in the last segment, we will talk about the Tysha character and if she is still alive, where she might be, and if Tyrion will ever see her again. So I hope you guys all enjoy the first episode, and if you enjoy, feel free to subscribe for more of this type of content. So a bit of a recap. So Davos in book 2 specifically, and also book 3, thinks about his finger bones, and then also kind of fiddles with them, especially in book 2, as they are what he deems to be his luck. It reminds him of his past and the person that he's become, from going from a smuggler to being, well, a knight, somebody within the household of Stannis, given a lot more power, and his children having a far better life because of what he did at Storm's End all those years ago. And so they're put a lot of emphasis on for Davos's character. But unfortunately, during the Battle of the Blackwater, he loses his luck, and that's kind of also symbolized in the way that they lose the Battle of the Blackwater. Davos's luck has finally turned. Stannis' cause is kind of flailing. Stannis has very little men, he has almost no support, and also you have Joffrey and Margaery getting married. It seems like the power is completely in Tywin's hands. But some of that seems to flip. Stannis has a great victory in the north against the wildlings, but there is this lingering idea that we get brought up in Dance with Dragons of Davos's fingerbones, because it would seem that they just were lost to the sea, or maybe the wildfire burned his fingerbones. But then we get a very interesting quote by Melisandre in her only chapter in the series. So this comes after we've seen the fake Mance being burned, aka Rattleshirt, and that we get this reveal that Mance is still alive. But this quote is very interesting in terms of how glamours work, and a specific reference to a bag of fingerbones. So here's the quote. "The bones help," said Melisandre, "the bones remember. The strongest glamours are built of such things, a dead man's boots, a hank of hair, a bag of finger bones, with whispered words and prayer. A man's shadow can be drawn forth from such, and draped about another like a cloak. The wearer's essence does not change, only his seeming." So this is really interesting because a bag of finger bones directly applies to Davos. And so there's really a couple thought processes you have to have here. Is this just a reference because it's something that sticks out to Melisandre? She knows Davos quite well, and this bag of finger bones is something very significant to his character? Or is it more to it? And for me, I personally think there has to be more to it, just based on the fact that Melisandre references such a specific thing about Davos, especially in terms of glamoring. So the issue you have with this theory, and I think this is the biggest issue really, is how would she have gotten Davos's fingerbones? The only way that this seems possible is either one, she somehow stole his fingerbones before he went to the Battle of the Blackwater. But how did she do this? Did she just do a swap? So another bag of something was put with Davos. Why would Melisandre do this? Was she given some sort of vision of that these finger bones would be relevant? Was it the idea that possibly Melisandre was given the finger bones because of the wildfire? Maybe the Lord of Light brought her these finger bones. Maybe the idea could be that the finger bones were found by someone, maybe during or after the battle, and that was given to Melisandre. Maybe that's why everybody assumed he was dead. I think the biggest issue and stretch of this theory is just the idea of how Melisandre would have gotten them. Or even if she didn't get them, is this supposed to be some sort of reference that she's going to try and glamour as Davos, or have somebody else glamour as Davos in the future? That's a little bit of what we just don't really know. There's a lot of gray area in this theory, but I think it's something that George leaves quite open-ended. But it is even more interesting because given Mel later says in A Storm of Swords that Davos has a role to play for the Lord of Light. Now, I think on our reads, we look at this and go, well, yeah, Davos has a role to play in terms of backing Stannis' cause. If he is Azor Ahai, well, of course, Davos would be a useful tool in helping him get the throne. And we know that to be the case. But is there more than just that? Has Melisandre seen something, using Davos in some regard? Either way, for the idea of this theory, let's say that she has the fingerbones. What does she need them for? That's the next question. Well, by the end of A Dance with Dragons, Jon Snow is allegedly dead. That's another theory I want to talk about at some point. The idea, did Jon Snow actually die? But let's just assume he's dead, and Stannis is said to be dead because of the pink letter. So at this point, Melisandre has really nobody to back. Jon, who she had been growing closer to, has suddenly died, and Stannis is also allegedly dead. And the other issue is that Melisandre can't see Stannis in the flames. Every time she looks for Stannis or Azor Ahai, she sees, snow. And that's kind of to represent that Jon might be Azor Ahai, or at least part of that prophecy. But either way, Mela's connection with Stannis seems to be wavering. So this gets to a very interesting point. Kind of like in the show, Melisandre might be wavering in her faith. Everything that she believed has kind of come crashing down. Jon is dead, Stannis is dead. She might be very desperate, and that might lead her to do some drastic actions. And we know that King's Blood is the main thing that Melisandre goes after that has true power. The issue is we've kind of seen that be not the case, just given the fact that Mance was not burned, Rattleshirt was not a king. He didn't have King's Blood either. And so we've seen that it's not necessarily King's Blood, it's really just blood sacrifices in general have power. That can breed life. But if we're going off the idea that it has to be King's Blood, what Melisandre's kind of been showing Stannis, the only King's Blood near her is Shireen. Now you could also go with the idea that Mance's child, but remember that was switched with Gilly. Now, Jon is really the only person that knows that at this moment, so could this baby be killed regardless? It's possible. If Jon's not there to say, oh, this child is not actually Mance's child, who knows, the child could be killed. But the other one, and the more important one, given we've had George saying that Stannis will burn Shireen, is that Shireen is nearby. And so many people have believed that Shireen's death will somehow be important to bringing Jon back, just given the fact that we have the idea that death can pay for life. That is really the only way. But the issue with Jon is his circumstance is so much different. Whereas a character like Catelyn, for instance, she doesn't warg into any other creatures, not living into something else. She gets brought back as like a zombie version of herself. Jon is different in the way of, for one, he's going to be warged inside of Ghost, so his spirit more or less seems like it will still be intact. Not to say that won't change him at all, but for the most part, it'll be very different if there's a resurrection with Jon than it would be for basically any other character in the series. But, again, not everybody is going to know that. But the issue is, if you believe Shireen is going to be burned so that Jon can come back, that's going to have to come way later in the book, given the fact that Stannis is supposed to burn her. Well, Stannis, remember, he's in the middle of a battle for getting Winterfell, and we know the whole first third of the book is probably going to be surrounding the build-up more or less to the Battle of Ice happening. What does Stannis do after that point if he's still alive? If he wins the Battle of Ice, how does he then take Winterfell? Does he take Winterfell at all? Does he go back to the Wall? The issue is you run into the point of Stannis and Shireen will not be really united until much later in the book. And so does that mean Jon is going to stay dead for predominantly most of the Winds of Winter? That's the issue you run into. And so I do want to put up what Quinn believed. So Quinn believed this idea that Mel is going to glamour as Davos and order her to be burned. But that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you think about the idea of Stannis is going to burn Shireen, because in this situation, it would be that Davos, as Hand of the King, would be saying these are Stannis' orders, but they actually aren't, and especially because Mel is the one being glamored, and Mel is the one, glamoring this, so it's all fake. So then Shireen is burned on those orders. But the problem is Stannis isn't involved with that at all, and so is it the idea that Stannis is directly going to order Shireen to be killed, or is there some kind of asterisk next to it that people believe Stannis ordered it, but Stannis didn't? That's the biggest issue you run into with this theory. And so I think, just to play it safe, if we're looking at the idea of Shireen's death, I believe Stannis has to be involved in some way, or I don't think George would have said it just as bluntly that Stannis is going to burn Shireen. So I think the idea that could make a ton of sense is that Mel does glamour as Davos, like Quinn said. But then Stannis, maybe after his whole Bolton conflict, going back to the Wall to defend the Wall from the others, maybe, Euron has blown the Horn of Winter and the wall is starting to come down. Who knows? Stannis might be in a very desperate position. He doesn't have the North all rallied underneath him. They don't have the men to fight off the others. And so Mel glamours herself to look like Davos, the one person that Stannis trusts pretty much more than anyone, the person that he knows can always get good counsel from. And maybe Mel as Davos tells Stannis that the only way is for Shireen to be burned to fulfill kind of the Nissa side of the Azor Ahai prophecy that Stannis has to kill a loved one. Now, it's very different given it's somebody he was in love with, it's said for Azor Ahai, but he does love his daughter, so it could maybe fit that idea. So at this point, Shireen is burned, and that could fulfill that part of it. Now, the issue I really have and struggle with is I don't know how this makes sense if Jon is still dead. And so that might lead to there is some sort of other sacrifice or some sort of magic other than Shireen's death that will lead to Jon being resurrected and or put back into his actual body. So if this is the case, that Stannis then willingly orders Shireen's burning, but it's still trickery and confusion that Melisandre is what causes her to die. It would be even more tragic if we see Davos similar to a, Ned's death situation with Arya, where Arya is trying to get to her father, but she just can't. He's out of reach and she doesn't have the power to save him. It could be similar to that. Davos arrives just as Shireen is about to be burned. He is the real Davos, but he's too far away to do anything and watches Shireen die. I could see a situation like that. I think it would make sense as to why a character like Stannis, who has shown really no ability to especially burn his own daughter, he's very resilient, and even burning someone like Edric Storm, you think that he's actually going to burn Shireen, his own daughter, who he just sent away just in Massey to get a whole army for her. That's the main issue you run into with the character of Shireen dying, is that Stannis, at the end of A Dance with Dragons, there is no reasonable way as to why he would do that. And if you also even want to make this even more spooky, given the fact that Stannis wants to make his seat on the wall the Night Fort, it would also play into the cursed feeling of the Night Fort. So that is the theory, more or less. I think there's massive issues with everything around this theory based upon how could Melisandre get the fingerbones. Very unclear. There's not a whole lot of evidence to support that that is the case outside of one line that can be interpreted in multiple different ways. I then also think that the timing of Jon's quote-unquote resurrection and Shireen's death, with Stannis being involved, raises a huge red flag with how timing of events works. Maybe this is something George is struggling with. We don't know. But the thing I really point to in this theory is that I think it's really interesting. I think it would really help us understand why Stannis would burn Shireen, but it still has massive issues that George would definitely have to figure out, how does this make sense given what's been told in the story so far. So we're going to break this video into 3 parts. Each part is really going to be talking about a different form of the disease, and then at the end I'll talk about how that's going to affect our main characters that have this disease and what that could mean for the story, as a lot of people have pointed to the idea that we might get some sort of grayscale plague, or as it's known in the story, Grey Plague. So the first variation is the childhood grayscale. Now, some people, I think, also get a little confused on this one as well, because it's hard to understand where Shireen's grayscale truly comes from, because we're told that a doll is the reason that she gets it, and so she has a doll, it interacts with her, and so you don't need the presence of somebody else touching you, or some sort of idea like that, that the more like childhood version of the disease spreads, but it is known to spread from children in dark, damp, cold locations, so it's commonly seen north of the wall, and then also at places like Dragonstone. So it's a little unclear in terms of Shireen and her version of the grayscale. Could it have been actually the same type that Jon Connington gets, but for Shireen, it was able to get treatment and stop? Or is the idea that there is a misconception on the way that Shireen actually got her grayscale, that she was actually affected with the childhood variation of the grayscale disease? We're not exactly sure, but the first version is childhood grayscale. Now, this is a type of grayscale that is not fast working. It isn't something that's going to kill you very quickly. It's something that's going to take usually years. But what we've also been told, it's a disease that doesn't really transmit in terms of, like, once the disease has run its course, it doesn't really transmit all that highly. It's not something where, like, For instance, I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID because that's the last time we've had a pandemic in this world. And so it's not like COVID, where COVID it spread very quickly, it could spread very rapidly. That isn't the case with the childhood version of Grayscale. It doesn't work that way. And something that's really important to understand with the first two versions of Grayscale is that both of them are not necessarily looking to kill the host quickly. It's more acting like a parasite. It's trying to find a host and to just live through that person, repopulate, all that kind of stuff. And so, for instance, when you see characters like John Connington, well, John Connington's not going to succumb fully to the Grayscale for years, probably. It's going to be more slow acting. Say something like a deadly disease. Like, for instance, it's different because COVID was something that was a deadly disease depending on who you were. If you were older, if you were younger, if you had conditions that left you vulnerable to COVID, it definitely could kill you. Now, when we talk about Grey Plague, which will be like the last one we'll talk about, it's very different in terms of if you got it, you pretty much were going to die. That's not necessarily how COVID worked, but it's kind of similar in like how it spreads. So we'll talk about that in a second. But the second version is the adult version of Grayscale, and its notable patients are kind of like people like the Stone Men that we encounter in Book 5. It's also been spread into somebody like John Connington in the main story. It's starting to grow through his fingers and then into his hand. And so this is something that we've seen. It can travel from direct contact. It can spread if like a stone man touches you or somebody with the disease is infected with it. It also seems to be infected in the waterway of the Sorrows and maybe airborne. But we also do know that it's relatively kept in isolation. So the disease doesn't really transfer that much unless you are very irresponsible with it, which is kind of what we could be seeing with John Connington. But very similar, it's not a disease that is known to be extremely transmissible unless there are certain conditions met, like what we see with John Connington in A Dance with Dragons. And also, it is something that doesn't kill you all that quickly, or at least it doesn't turn you into a stone man and make you go mad in the end. It takes a while to get to that point. And so that's what I mean by when we talk about, for instance, the idea of a grayscale plague. I think that people are misunderstanding what that means. John Connington right now does not have the Grey Plague in the story. He has just adult grayscale. That's what he has. He has the adult version of what a child would have. And so that gets us to our last one. So the last one is what the big one is. It's called Grayscale. The one patient that we know is that Illyrio Mopatis's wife, Sarah, actually succumbed to this disease. Grey Plague is something that has a high fatality rate. It is something that if you get it, you have a very good chance of dying. It is something that is not like regular Grayscale at all. It is fast acting and can kill an entire population in a very quick amount of time. We know from our history in A Song of Ice and Fire that Grand Maester Pycelle, while being at Old Town, this disease happened there, and they had to quarantine the entire city. Basically, what that meant was nobody could leave. Ships were not allowed to come into the city. If ships were trying to leave, those ships would be burned. If people tried to leave the city to get away from the disease, they would also be killed or put in prison because they didn't want the disease to go to the rest of Westeros or the rest of the world in general. And so what ended up happening was it basically killed a good portion of the population in Old Town. 3/4 of the Citadel was killed because of this disease, but it eventually did pass. The Lord Hightower did the right actions. Similar to like when we had COVID, we were basically shutting down the entire world. You couldn't travel anywhere. You had to stay home unless you had a job that it was like you were needed to have the whole country function. For the most part, we went into a lockdown to try and prevent the disease's spread and let it run its course. Same idea of what Old Town is doing here, and it seemed to be highly effective in terms of sparing the rest of the world for the most part. Now, see, this is what a Grey Plague is. So a Grey Plague is not really like Grayscale at all. It's kind of almost the polar opposite, even though it is a variation of Grayscale itself. It's just the more deadly version. This is something that we're told can be spread by rats. It can be spread for a number of ways in terms of just touching someone else that has the disease. It is the one that I think most people think about when they think about a Grayscale plague breaking out. So Grey Plague is, I think, our conversation we need to talk about. Will we see this in A Song of Ice and Fire in terms of on Westeros? And so at this point of A Song of Ice and Fire, do we think this disease is going to be spread? And do we think it's going to come from either John Connington or Shireen? We've gotten some nods to Shireen and her disease. it not being fully gone, like more it's in a dormant kind of a sleeping stage. That's what Val believes. Now the wildlings have a very extreme view on Grayscale, that the people that have it should more or less be cast out, they should be killed so they don't spread the disease. So they look at Shireen and go, why was she allowed to live? This disease could kill everybody if it was to come back. And so a lot of people have theorized, if Shireen is burned, will it cause the disease to reawaken? And with this idea of like stone dragons being awoken, is that actually to mean the gray plague or grayscale will spread rampant throughout the north because of Shireen's burning and all of that? You also look at where they are at the wall. It is also a great place for where the children's grayscale comes from, like these cold, damp, dark conditions. The wall would fit that quite well, but the issue that I see with this is Shireen doesn't have Grey Plague. So if you're assuming that blood magic is what is going to cause the disease to spread, there's no real evidence of that in the story at all. Like, we have nothing that would prove that to be the case. We've barely seen Grey Plague at all, and when we have seen it, it has seemed to form more from like normal human things, like spreading from a rat to then spreading to the people on maybe a trading galley. That trading galley then goes to Old Town or it goes to wherever, and that spreads the disease. So it seems more based in reality than something that could be awakened by magic. But I do think that Grayscale will play a major role in Shireen's plotline overall, because I think that Grayscale will be another component of why Shireen is burned. Because the whole wildling population would actually back this idea that she should be sacrificed to get rid of the corruption within her. And so it can play a role into maybe why Stannis believes he has to burn her, or however that goes down. Wednesday's video, I talked a little bit about the theories of how Shireen might die. So this one could just be an added bonus to that is another reason why she's burned. Now, John Connington's a whole different story. So John Connington has active grayscale on him right now. He could spread the disease by touch, even if he doesn't know it. If he, for instance, just takes off his glove and maybe he touches a wine glass or whatever, the disease could spread that way, based on what we've kind of seen with Shireen and how she gets the disease and all that kind of stuff. And at this point, do I think that John Connington will be the reason there is a gray plague or anything like that? No, because John Connington doesn't have Grey Plague. He has Grayscale. He just has that normal disease. But what I think could play a factor in it is it could be something similar to, say, Jorah and Daenerys, where this whole time John Connington has been hiding this disease from young Griff. That could have dire repercussions. Maybe he spreads the disease to somebody, maybe even young Griff himself, and that is something that affects everyone. And young Griff could be sitting here going, you were supposed to be my father figure, and you hid this disease from me, you put everyone in danger, and it could lead to John Connington being in this state where he's tossed out again. It's kind of mirroring the Robert's Rebellion era for him as well. He was tossed out, he was sent into exile more or less. And you think about everything going on, young Griff might not be Aegon, he could be a Blackfire, so John Connington was really set up and was used, and even though he still views young Griff as a son, now young Griff is even telling him he has to go because of the danger that he poses. And maybe John Connington then will go to Old Town to try and get this cured to come back. The same idea of what the show did with Jorah and Daenerys. And you could just have that whole idea play out. And maybe Jorah then spreads another plague in Old Town. I just don't think that we have the time for any type of gray plague or a grayscale epidemic going on in Westeros. There's just not enough time at this point. Do we really need to introduce some sort of disease that's wiping out, a good portion of the population when we already have threats of apocalypse with Euron and also the others? We're way more focused on trying to condense the plot as a whole. And so spending a whole amount of time to worry about gray plague or grayscale spreading, I just don't think we have the time to do that. And I think another thing I could play into John Connington's case is, say it gets out to the public and people realize the hand of the king, the person that's, kind of in charge next to young Griff, is this person that has grayscale. He could infect all of them. It could turn the public against young Griff to some degree and force young Griff to remove John Connington from office. So there's a lot there. There's a lot there that I think grayscale will have a part in. But I don't think it's going to be the main focus of something. Like, I don't think it's going to take in like an idea of like, say for instance, the Sparrows was the main like antagonist to Cersei's reign as the series went on. I don't think the same is going to be for like young Griff, where all of a sudden young Griff is going to have to deal with how does he contain a gray plague or grayscale when you have all these other threats going on, you have all these other issues that are going on, that you don't need to introduce another one, which would just prolong the story. It would take up pages of time to talk about the subject. And whereas I find it very interesting, I like the idea of George exploring disease, it just doesn't feel like it needs a place in the story at this moment. I think that Grayscale has its role in the story to serve as a big moment for characters, for payoffs because of these diseases they've had, how that will influence the story going forward with characters like Shireen and John Connington. So I maybe am a bit different than I think other people in their predictions of having some sort of Grayscale outbreak. I don't think it's the case. I don't think we have time for it, and that's even given we even get the Winds of Winter. But let me know what you guys think about Grayscale and the possibility of it spreading. Let me know down in the comments. And we're going to be talking about the idea of where did Tysha go after more or less everything that happened to her at Casterly Rock, everything that went down between Tywin and Tyrion. Where did she go? This is the question that's left open-ended at the end of A Storm of Swords with Tyrion's last chapter, and it's something that Tyrion thinks about quite a lot. Where did Tysha go? She represents one of the only people that ever loved Tyrion for him, and not for something else like monetary gain, anything like that, like Shay, Bronn, other people around him. And so that was a huge focus. And the one thing that's very unclear is George has given us very little to go off of, very little clues, and in a lot of ways, we are also along the journey of Tyrion, where Tyrion has nothing to go off of and is grasping for anything. We as a reader are kind of the same way. There's very few things that are brought up about where Tysha could be, and there is an interesting explanation, albeit I don't know if I actually subscribe to it. So the most common answer, and the theory I've seen the most proposed for Tysha as a character, is that she is actually the sailor's wife character that we meet through Arya in Davos. Now, right off the bat, why would this be? Why is this person so special? And she does have this weird custom where she has men marry her to then sleep with her. So it would also kind of fulfill that idea of like, okay, Tyrion, well, he actually did marry her, and that was Tyrion's first time, and maybe also Tysha. I don't actually remember if that is ever made clear in the series, but that's the way I'm going to go off of it. And the idea is that she has a child named Lana, which she has some interesting characteristics and things we know about her. First of all, she has golden hair, very similar to the Lannister hair of being very golden. Now, Tyrion is different in that he has very different hair compared to characters like Cersei and Jaime. But the other part of this that's interesting is that she is exactly 14 years old, which would add up completely if the theory is that the sailor's wife is, well, Tysha. That would add up narratively in terms of the time that would have needed to happen. And her name, which being Lana, is the feminine form of the name Lan. And if you think about Lan the Clever, that's basically where the whole last name of the Lannisters come from. There's a lot of interesting connections. Like, George could have made this character have any different hair, but just chooses to go with golden. Could have had this person named anything different, but it's something that can connect to the Lannisters. So the question then is there anything else besides this to really back it up? Well, not really. The issue you run into is that Tysha says that her husband was a sailor. Tyrion is obviously not a sailor. Why did she go to Davos? So after everything that happened in the West and Casterly Rock and everything that goes down, why does she go to Davos? You know, you might be thinking, well, with the money that she's made, maybe she would try to make a living of herself. In terms of where she was, and maybe her family disgraced her or anything along those lines because of what happened, we just don't really know. Like, what was her motivation to go to Davos specifically? It is also said that the sailor's wife, her husband, is already dead. Well, Tyrion is also not dead either, so that doesn't really make a lot of sense either. Also, if you think about the idea that Tysha isn't a whore, so if you think about wherever they go, well, Tysha was never that. And so there's some conflicting things on there. And so I think that there are some things that make sense. There's some things that don't make sense. I think on face value, if Tysha is a character we've run into in the main series, it probably is the sailor's wife. But I don't think that we've seen Tysha for a lot of reasons. I think Tysha is a character that is kind of going to represent Tyrion looking for that love that he never had and him not being able to find it. You know, that is already passed on, and it's going to be Tyrion having to come to terms with that and not looking at his past and all of that kind of stuff. I don't think we'll see Tysha again unless Tysha is still in the Westerlands. But the real question would be, okay, Tyrion never runs into Tysha, so she probably wasn't at Casterly Rock. So where was she? Is she still in Westeros? We just don't necessarily know. And the other part of it is like Tywin, I don't think would even care where Tysha went. And even if Tywin was in control of that, he might have just said, oh yeah, Kevin, just make sure she leaves the castle, the city, whatever. And Kevin's also dead. So there's no real indicators of kind of following where Tysha went. And so this is the other theory that's been proposed about the Sailor's Wife, is that instead of it being Tyrion, it is actually his uncle Garyon Lannister. Given the fact that he is somebody that had been a sailor, he is thought to be dead, and he has been to Bravos. It makes a lot of sense, especially when you look at the idea of, okay, you still apply to the name being the feminine version of Lan. It would have that Lannister connection. The golden hair would make a lot of sense. I also think it would fit Garyon more than it would a character like Tyrion, because if the Sailor's Wife is just from Bravos, it would make sense given the fact that Garyon would have been there. Now, the other thing that is brought up quite a lot is that this Sailor's Wife, who is never named, she is interesting just because she seems to know Westerosi speech really well. And so that would imply that maybe she has had a lot of interaction with people from Westeros. Maybe she was from Westeros initially. We don't know. And so this theory is very vague in terms of trying to find out who Tysha is. I do kind of like the narrative theming, though, of us, the reader, are trying to figure out where Tysha is as well. Maybe Tyrion can have some shot at love, but the truth is that love is probably gone. And even if Tyrion was to find Tysha, why would Tysha have any good feelings towards Tyrion? Because of her getting involved with Tyrion, it gave her incredible trauma. It might have destroyed her relationship with people around her who don't respect her now because of what she's been reduced to. All that kind of stuff. It would have ruined her life. All that Tysha would have gotten out of it would have been money. She had the person that she loved in Tyrion stripped away from her, and Tyrion just watched as she was brutally attacked. And I think it's a dark thing to put out there. I think we could see some sort of like a Shara Dane type thing, where maybe if Tyrion was to ever figure out what happened with Tysha, it's that because of the actions committed by Tywin and Jaime and stuff like that, that she actually ended up just killing herself. And that's why we haven't seen her in the main story at all. That's why Tyrion never sees her in the Westerlands or any of that after that moment. That to me makes sense. I know people might also think, well, maybe because they wanted to keep Tysha away from Tyrion so much to keep up the lie, that maybe they paid for her to be sent to Bravos, or at least implied to Tysha that she needs to go there or else. That's also possible as well. I think that would really help understand why Tysha would be in Bravos, and then also not revealing like her name or any of that stuff. So I think there's some interesting stuff here, but I don't necessarily think this is Tysha. Let me know what you guys think. We really don't have a lot of information on it, just pure speculation, but I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.